It's been a year since Dragon Age the Veilguard released, and I wanted to come back to this game and see where it stands now. See, when it first launched in October of 2024, put about 60 hours into it, completed the main story, did most of the companion quests, and came away with some fairly mixed feelings. In my original video, I tried to be fair about what worked and what didn't. A year later now, with some distance from the initial release, I think it's worth revisiting to understand what happened here and why the game ended up the way it did. Now, the game sold approximately 1.5 million copies, completely missing EA's sales expectations by nearly 50%. By March 2025, just 5 months after release, it was added to PlayStation Plus. For context, major releases typically wait much longer before hitting really any subscription services. Following the announcement of these sales figures, EA stock dropped 17%, and these aren't just numbers, they really tell us something about how the game was received commercially, regardless of its quality. The question I want to explore in this video is why that happened. Now, the developmental history is definitely an important context here. The game was originally conceived as a co-op title, then pivoted to a live service game before finally being rebooted as a single-player role-playing game after Anthem's miserable failure. That's a lot of changes over nearly a decade of development, and when a game goes through that many fundamental shifts in vision, it often shows in the final product. I think that's part of what we saw with the Veilguard. The game feels like it's caught between multiple different philosophies, never really committing to a single vision. The game ended up receiving an 80 on Metacritic for the PS5 release, but user scores were significantly lower at around 3.9. Now, I'm not going to pretend that user scores on Metacritic are the ultimate measure of a game's quality. Review bombing is real, and it happens for all sorts of reasons. Some are legitimate and some are not. But in this circumstance, the gap between the critical and user reception does tell us something about the disconnect between what critics evaluated in some vacuum versus what longtime fans of the series expected from a Dragon Age game. Critics judged it as a competent action RPG, fans judged it against its legacy of Origins, Dragon Age 2, and Inquisition, and found it lacking in areas that mattered to them most. Let me start by first talking about the combat, because this is where my perspective has sort of shifted since my original playthrough. Back then, I said that the combat was engaging, I enjoyed my time playing as a mage, the abilities felt impactful, and the moment-to-moment action was actually satisfying. And honestly, that's all true on the surface level. The combat system functions as a well-suited action RPG. Casting a lightning storm and watching it chain between enemies looks great, feels great, and abilities have weight and impact. The animation work is also pretty solid. But here's the thing that I've been thinking about since that day. Dragon Age was never really meant to be an action RPG in this way. The series was built with its identity on tactical and party-based combat. Origins let you pause, assess the battlefield, issue commands to each party member individually, and manage these complex positioning and threat mechanics. You could zoom out with the tactical camera, survey the entire encounter, and then orchestrate your party to go in. You can also switch between characters mid-combat. There was a tactic system where you can program how your companions would behave in different situations, essentially creating these AI routines that reflected your own strategic approach. If you wanted your mage to prioritize crowd control over damage, you could also configure it that way. The combat had layers of depth that rewarded strategic thinking and planning ahead. Even Dragon Age 2, which got plenty of criticism for streamlining the combat and making it more action-oriented, still maintained direct control over companions. And I've said this twice now, you can still switch to them mid-combat and play as them directly. Tactical camera was also still there. Inquisition continued this tradition, even as it moved further toward the real-time action. The series obviously was gradually evolving, and that's fine, but it kept its core tactical elements that defined it from the very start. The Veilguard, unfortunately, removed these elements entirely. You cannot control your companions directly, you cannot switch to them during combat. I know this seems like a weird point to harp on, but it's something that genuinely frustrated me. They also don't even have health bars and they cannot be killed. They're essentially invincible NPCs who use an ability around every 30 seconds when you command them to. There is no tactic system to program their behavior, There's no real coordination beyond just telling them when to use their one active ability. This fundamentally changes what Dragon Age combat is about. Your companions just become ability cooldowns rather than party members you're actively managing. Their basic attacks contribute very little to the overall damage output, and in practice, they're mostly just there to occasionally trigger combo detonations when you set up the right status effects. Playing as a mage, I found myself constantly killing enemies because my companions couldn't hold aggro unless I was specifically using their taunt abilities, and even then, it was pretty inconsistent. This system works fine for a single player action game where you're the main character and everyone else is a supporting cast, but it's definitely a significant departure from what made Dragon Age's combat feel distinctive. This design choice raises questions about who the game was made for. Longtime Dragon Age fans wanted the tactical depth. People who prefer pure action combat have plenty of other options that also do it better. The Veilguard's combat sits in this awkward middle ground where it's too simplified for tactics fans, but not as refined as it should be to compete with the action RPGs out there. It's competent enough, but it's not exceptional in either direction. It's worth noting that Baldur's Gate 3 released not long before the Veilguard and showed that there's still a strong audience for deep, tactical party-based combat in the RPG space. That game sold extremely well and even won Game of the Year, in part because it leaned into that complexity rather than attempting to simplify it for the masses. Larian trusted their audience to engage with these systems that had depth and didn't feel the need to streamline everything for the mass appeal. The Veilguard, however, made the opposite choice, and I think that's part of why it struggled to connect with the core Dragon Age audience while also really failing to attract a new one. Now, the skill tree initially seems substantial. There are 3 specializations per class, numerous abilities to unlock, freedom to respec at any time. It just looks like there's a lot of customization available. But as I spent more time with it, I realized most of the nodes are just passive stat increases. You're mostly just making your numbers bigger rather than fundamentally changing how you play. A Storm Mage and a Death Mage feel largely the same in practice, but with different visual effects on their spells. You're still doing these same basic rotations, still approaching encounters the same way, and still playing the same core gameplay loop. I went into this game wanting to play a morally ambiguous character, someone who might prioritize personal power or just making ruthless decisions for really no reason. The game doesn't accommodate that fantasy at all. Dragon Age Origins lets you make deals with demons. You can sacrifice your companions for power, take bribes, and betray your allies in a number of ways. You can play a character who is genuinely morally questionable. Even Mass Effect's Renegade system lets you be ruthless and pragmatic. Inquisition, which was more restrictive than Origins to begin with, still lets you make some genuinely difficult choices about who to sacrifice or which factions to support. The Veilguard doesn't offer anything comparable. Every interaction feels designed to avoid making anyone feel uncomfortable, to keep things light and positive literally the whole time. The villains reflect the same exact issue. Elganar and Gillenane want to control the world with blight. Their motivations are presented straightforward. It's all about conquest and destruction. There's really no nuance or complexity to their goals. They're evil just because the story needs some antagonists. The game starts with Solus as the antagonist, and Solus is somewhat interesting because he has understandable goals that happen to conflict with the greater good, so to speak. He's trying to restore the world of elves and to tear down the veil and return things to how they were, even though doing so would destroy the current world. That's a decent moral dilemma, but he's quickly sidelined for some reason in favor of these more straightforward and boring villains, probably because that sort of complexity was too risky or too difficult to write around. The companion system is also pretty subpar. Each companion has their own quest line that opens up new areas and provides some decent character development. Honestly, these quests are generally well constructed from a mechanical standpoint. They take you to interesting new locations that you wouldn't see otherwise. They introduce new enemies and new scenarios and give you some decent loot. But what's missing is the friction between your companions. They sort of all get along. They have some banter, they'll support each other, sometimes they'll get into arguments, but they work together really without any issues. There's hardly any conflict or competing ideologies, and the ones that are presented really aren't that deep. No one ever fundamentally disagrees about the mission or challenges your approach to leading the team. Everyone just agrees that you're the leader. In Origins, Alistar and Morgan had opposing worldviews that created constant tension. Alistar was idealistic and he believed in honor and duty. Morgan was more pragmatic and cynical, believing that power and survival were what mattered. They clashed constantly and you had to manage that relationship. The Veilguard's companions, in contrast, are all rated G. No one wants to cause any issues, and if they do, they want to apologize and amend things as quickly as possible. Davrin cares about his griffin and his duty as a Grey Warden. Nev wants to protect Minrathis from corruption. Balara is fascinated by ancient elven artifacts and technology. Lucanus struggles with the demon inside him, and realistically speaking, these are fine character concepts. There's solid foundations for interesting characters, but they don't evolve much beyond their initial premise. The conflicts that do exist are internal to each character and resolved through personal questline. There's no friction between party members that you have to navigate. The writing throughout the game has the same quality of just being so careful and inoffensive to literally anybody. Dialogue often feels like it's trying to avoid any real edge or real conflict. Characters speak in ways that feel more contemporary and like therapeutic than fitting for a dark fantasy setting where the world is literally about to end. People are always trying to validate each other's feelings. They communicate their boundaries clearly. They process their trauma in very modern terms. Now, I'm not saying characters should be cruel or that emotional intelligence is bad, but there's just something genuinely off about the tone in this game in general. It doesn't match the setting or the stakes. When you're fighting these ancient evil gods that are trying to destroy the world, the dialogue shouldn't sound like it's taking place in a preschool. The voice acting is generally competent. The actors do a very good job, but they're working with material that really doesn't give them much room to create memorable performances. Everyone speaks in the same measured and reasonable tone. There are very few moments where characters get genuinely angry, emotional, or really irrational. It's all very controlled and safe. The technical presentation has issues as well that become more noticeable over time. Lip syncing is frequently off throughout the game. Mouths don't quite match what the characters are saying, which is distracting during the dialogue scenes. Facial animations lack any real subtlety that you'd expect from like a 2024 release from a studio, especially with BioWare's pedigree. Characters don't have a wide range of expressions, and those emotional moments often fall flat on their face because they really don't convey what the voice is trying to communicate. This might seem like a minor complaint, but they add up over a 60-hour experience, and they do affect immersion in ways that are hard to ignore. The choice system, which should be central to a BioWare role-playing game, feels thin. The Treviso versus Minrathis decision has real consequences that do play out throughout the rest of the game. The city you don't save falls under enemy control, certain quest lines change, and you lose access to some vendors and gain access to others. That's good. That's the kind of consequences choices should have, but there's really only a handful of choices that actually matter in any meaningful way. Most dialogue decisions throughout the game have no impact whatsoever. You'll make dozens and dozens of choices about what to say to companions or NPCs, and the conversation proceeds the same way regardless. Companions will occasionally approve or disapprove of your choices, and you'll see a little indicator pop up showing their reaction, but there's no real clear pattern to it, and it rarely affects anything substantially. I couldn't figure out what Nev wanted from me half the time. She'd approve of something that seemed like it should upset her, then disapprove of something that seemed to align with her values. And even when companions did disapprove, it really didn't change our relationship in a noticeable way. The hardening system is where companions who disapprove of you enough become less effective in combat and have slightly different dialogue. In my playthrough, only one companion became hardened because of a major choice I made, and it barely registered as a change. No matter what I did, I just couldn't get other companions to harden the same way. Enemy variety is limited throughout the game. You'll fight the same basic types from the beginning to the very end. Darkspawns, Demons, Venatori, and the Ansem. Each faction has a few different unit types, and there are elite versions that are tougher, but the core roster is still very small. Elite versions are functionally just regular enemies with more health and maybe one or two additional attacks. On higher difficulties, this leads to fights that drag on, and not because they're strategically challenging or because you need to adapt your approach, but simply because enemies become damage sponges that take forever to kill. I eventually adjusted the difficulty settings to reduce enemy health because encounters were taking far too long without being any more interesting or engaging. The Qunari character models that have been redesigned look more human-like with horns, losing much of their distinctive, almost alien-like appearance from previous games. In Origins and Inquisition, Qunari looked genuinely different from other races, with more unique facial structures that made them feel like a completely different species. In the Veilguard, they're just tall humans with horns. Now, after the game's disappointing sales, EA CEO Andrew Wilson suggested it might have performed better as a live service title, stating that games need to connect with players seeking shared world features. This comment is actually pretty revealing because it suggests that EA may have drawn entirely the wrong lesson from the game's underperformance. The issue wasn't that the game was single player. Players specifically wanted a single player Dragon Age experience. The problem was that the single player experience didn't deliver what Dragon Age fans were looking for. It didn't have the tactical depth, the moral complexity, the same dark tone, the meaningful choices that defined the series. Making it a live service game would have not fixed anything. A year later, and the discourse around the game has largely faded. People have moved on to other things, and that might be the most telling indicator of where the game stands. Great games continue to be discussed and analyzed years after release. Truly terrible games become case studies in what went wrong and tales from the industry to learn from. The Veilguard has mostly just been forgotten. It came, it failed to make an impact, and now it's mostly just a footnote in the Dragon Age franchise and BioWare's history.